Jack Johnson wasn't just the first black heavyweight champion. He was the white man's worst nightmare. And the best part? He knew it.
Jack Johnson was a big inspiration because of what he did out of the ring. He was so bold. Jack Johnson was a black man back when white people lynched Negroes on weekends.
He destroyed white fighters in the ring, flaunted his relationships with white women, and lived life like a king. And white America lost their minds. They banned him. They hunted him. They even rewrote the law just to put him behind bars. But Jack Johnson wasn't going out without a fight. The world had never seen anything like him. Long before Muhammad Ali, and even before Joe Louis, at a time when black men were expected to shut up, stay humble, and know their place, Johnson did the exact opposite. So how did a poor black kid from Galveston, Texas, rise to the top and become the most feared, most hated, and most unstoppable man in America? Let's go back to where it all began. Jack Johnson would later be known as the Galveston Giant, a man who shattered racial barriers in boxing by becoming the first black heavyweight champion of the world at a time when that was never supposed to happen. And if that wasn't enough to infuriate white America, he took it even further, showing off his wealth, driving expensive cars, openly dating, and even marrying white women. At the height of segregation during the Jim Crow era, this wasn't just rebellious, it was dangerous. Johnson's very existence was an insult to everything white supremacists held dear, and they made sure he paid the price. He was thrown in prison on trumped-up, racially motivated charges. They wanted him erased. But here's the thing, Jack Johnson wasn't supposed to make it in the first place, because if you had seen him as a child, you never would have believed this frail and cowardly black boy from Texas would grow up to become one of the most influential and most hated men in America. He was born John Arthur Johnson in 1878, the third of 9 children and the son of former slaves. His father Henry had fought in the Civil War and passed down his exceptional physique to his son, a trait that would define him in the ring. But here's what makes Johnson's story so fascinating. Unlike most black kids of his time, he didn't grow up believing in racial inferiority. America was brutally segregated, and black people suffered severe oppression. But in his neighborhood, poverty didn't care about race. Black and white families were equally poor. His childhood friends were white, and according to him, they never bullied him or treated him differently. And so, he never learned the lesson that society tried to teach black children at the time, that white people were superior to him. Maybe that's why he never acted like they were. And that made him the most dangerous black man in America. After 5 years in school, he dropped out because he was expected to work. And one of the most valuable things he learned during his time at school came not from his teachers or from the streets. It came from his own mother. One day, Johnson came home bruised, beaten up by another kid from school. But instead of comforting him and patching up his cuts and bruises, his mother scolded him. "If you ever come home like that again," she warned, "I'll give you an even worse beating." That was the last time he ever backed down from a fight. This lesson in toughness was his first step on the road to becoming world heavyweight champion. But this was just the beginning. The real battles were yet to come. After quitting school, Johnson found jobs in a barber shop, a gambling parlor, and in the Galveston docks. But none of it gave him purpose, and he soon found himself moving on to Dallas in search of a fresh start. And whether he knew it or not, this decision would change everything. When he arrived there, he first found work in stables, exercising horses. But he was then offered an apprenticeship painting carriages, and the wheels of fate were set in motion. His new boss was a man named Walter Lewis. Lewis enjoyed organizing sparring sessions for his friends, and so Johnson jumped in. And from that moment, he was hooked. From that point on, boxing became his life. He traveled across the country, soaking up knowledge from fighters wherever he could. He even traveled all the way to Boston to meet one of his heroes, the legendary welterweight boxer Barbados Joe Walcott. He continued to do whatever jobs he was given, but after losing his position in the stables, Johnson returned to Galveston and was given a cleaning job in a boxing gym. At the same time, he found sporadic work as a sparring partner for other boxers. At one point, when the circus came to town, he even fought a carnival boxer who offered $5 to anyone who could last 4 rounds with him. Johnson knocked him out. It was in that gym, where he scrubbed floors by day and fought by night, that he finally saved up enough to buy his first pair of boxing gloves. And it wasn't long until he was given an opportunity to use them. Johnson's first recorded fight wasn't in a ring, it was on the streets. After being arrested for brawling with a man named Davy Pearson, Johnson found himself in jail over a dispute involving a game of craps. Pearson accused Johnson of snitching on him to the police, and when the two were released, there was only one way to settle it. With a crowd gathered around, the two men squared off. No gloves, no rules, just fists. And Johnson emerged victorious. His next opponent was a dock worker with the unforgettable name John Must-Have-It Lee. The two met for a bare-knuckle bout, but just as the fight started heating up, police arrived to shut it down because prize fighting was illegal in Texas. But Johnson wasn't leaving without a finish. The fighters and spectators moved to the beach, turning the sandy shore into an impromptu boxing ring. Johnson took care of business and took home the first purse of his career, $1.50. It wasn't much, but it was the beginning of something much bigger. After his street fights and small-time bouts, Johnson knew it was time to go pro. In his official debut, he made a statement, winning the Texas middleweight title by second-round knockout. It was a glimpse of what was to come.
The great Stanley Ketchel, the Michigan assassin, is out cold.
But his first real test came against a man known as Klondike, John Haynes, a fighter also known as the Black Hercules. In their first fight, Haynes defeated Johnson and boldly declared himself the Black Heavyweight Champion, a title that wasn't officially recognized, but one that carried weight among black fighters of the time. The rematch was an all-out war, 20 brutal rounds, both men still standing when the final bell rang. The fight ended in a draw. But in their third and final showdown, Johnson finally defeated Haynes when he didn't answer the bell for the 14th. 2 months later, Johnson faced a new challenge when he stepped into the ring to fight Joe Choinski, a seasoned white veteran of Polish heritage. It was a disaster. Choinski knocked him out cold in the third round. And to make matters worse, both men were arrested for illegal prize fighting, and they found themselves in jail, unable to afford bail. That could have been the end of the story. But then the sheriff saw an opportunity. Instead of leaving them locked up, he came up with a profitable twist. Johnson and Choinski would be allowed to go home at night as long as they agreed to spar in their jail cell during the day. The result? An impromptu prison fight club. Word spread, and soon crowds gathered every day to watch them go at it. For a small entry fee, of course. After 23 days behind bars, they were finally freed. But by then, something unexpected had happened. Johnson and Choinski had become friends. And more importantly, Johnson had learned the most valuable lesson of his career: how to fight smart. Choinski, recognizing Johnson's raw talent, taught him the art of defense. He showed him how to counterpunch, how to outthink an opponent instead of just overpowering them, how to use movement instead of brute force. When Johnson walked out of jail, he wasn't just a fighter anymore. He was a strategist. He was more skilled, more calculated, more dangerous. From that point on, his defensive mastery and counterpunching style became his greatest weapons. It was the turning point in his journey to becoming the most feared heavyweight. Johnson finally won his first official title when he fought a towering Denver Ed Martin, who he outpointed over 20 rounds. With that win, he was crowned the world-colored heavyweight champion. And the fact that such a title even existed is a reminder of the kind of country America was back then. A black fighter, no matter how dominant, wasn't given a chance to fight for the true world heavyweight title. So they created a separate belt, a separate division, a separate ceiling, one that was never meant to be broken. But Johnson wasn't about to be confined. Even before he defeated Denver Ed Martin, he was already considered a top heavyweight contender. And in the next 5 years, he cemented his place as one of the best black heavyweights on the planet. He defended his world-colored heavyweight title 12 times, defeating the best black heavyweights of the era, taking his record from 11, 3, and 6 when he won the title to an impressive 46, 5, and 8. Jack Johnson wasn't just fighting for a title. He was fighting to prove he belonged at the very top, and soon the world would have no choice but to recognize it. But as his fame and fortune increased, so did his wild and shocking lifestyle. He wasn't just a world-class fighter. He was a flashy, unpredictable showman, and his personal life became as controversial as his dominance in the ring. Johnson claimed that earlier in his life, he had married a black woman named Mary Austin, though there's no official record of it. It's likely they were never legally married, but he always introduced her as Mrs. Jack Johnson whenever they were seen together in Galveston. He also had a relationship with a black prostitute named Clara Kerr, but that ended in betrayal. Kerr left Johnson for his friend, William Bryant, and to make it worse, the couple stole Johnson's clothes and jewelry before running off together. That one had to sting. This was more than just a heartbreak, it was a breaking point. This was the moment he decided he was done with black women. From then on, he only pursued white women, a decision that sent white America into a full-blown meltdown. And honestly, you can't overstate how bold this was. We're talking about the early 1900s, a time when black men were lynched for just looking at a white woman the wrong way. And here's Jack Johnson, not only dating them, but flaunting it, rubbing it in people's faces. It was more than scandalous. It was the ultimate middle finger to white supremacy. One of the first times this made headlines was when he went on a 3-month boxing tour in Australia and had a brief affair with Alma Lola Toy, a white woman from Sydney. And here's where Johnson took things a step further. He openly stated that he planned to marry her. When news of this hit the press, it sparked outrage. A black man, especially a famous one, marrying a white woman? Unthinkable. Toy may have been the first, but she certainly wasn't the last, and the crimes around his hookups with white women were only set to get a whole lot worse. But before we dive deeper into the personal scandals that followed, let's get back to what made Jack Johnson truly unstoppable, his rise to the heavyweight championship. In 1902, a fighter named Joe Gans had captured the World Lightweight Championship, becoming the first black champion in any weight division in the process. But despite his impressive record, Johnson found it impossible to secure his own shot at the world title. Because, to put it bluntly, the world wasn't ready for a black heavyweight champion. People could just about tolerate a black champion in other weight classes, but the world heavyweight title? That was the absolute pinnacle of the sport, and the thought of a black man becoming heavyweight champ was more than most white people could stomach. So although he took on white opponents in the ring, the reigning heavyweight champion James Jeffries outright refused to face him. In fact, he retired from boxing altogether rather than defend his heavyweight crown against a black challenger. After Jeffries' retirement, the vacant title was claimed by Marvin Hart, known as the Louisville Plumber, and he in turn lost the title to Canadian boxer Tommy Burns. Burns was different. He successfully defended his title 13 times and was the first heavyweight champion to travel the world and take on all challengers. He wanted to prove that he was the very best. His words, not mine. "I will defend my title against all comers, none barred." By this I mean white, black, Mexican, Indian, or any other nationality. I propose to be the champion of the world, not the white, or the Canadian, or the American. If I am not the best man in the heavyweight division, I don't want the title. Even so, Johnson had to wait 2 years for his shot at Burns's title, taunting and goading his future opponent in an attempt to get him to step into the ring. And eventually, finally, his persistence paid off. Well, that and the $30,000 Burns was promised by promoters for taking the fight. The venue was to be Sydney Stadium in Australia, and with 20,000 in attendance, the fight between Johnson and the dwarfed 5'7" heavyweight champion Burns went to 14 rounds before it was broken up by police. Johnson had been well on top when the fight was stopped, and he was duly named the winner. With this victory, he claimed Burns's title, becoming what white people everywhere had long been dreading, the first black heavyweight champion of the world.
Jack Johnson becomes heavyweight champion of the world, December 26, 1908.
If they hated him before, they were about to hate him even more. While it was bad enough just that he was black, Johnson was also bold. He wasn't content with just beating white men in the ring. He wanted to rub their noses in it. And the newly crowned champion wasted no time doing just that. At the time of his title fight, Johnson had started seeing yet another white woman, a Manhattan prostitute named Hattie McClay, although her real name was Anna Peterson. She often accompanied Johnson when he was traveling for his fights and had traveled to Australia with him for the bout with Burns. But then, on arriving in Victoria, British Columbia, Johnson tried to check in to the best hotel in town, only to be refused a room because he was traveling with a white woman. But it didn't stop there. As he made his way back to his hometown of Galveston, where he should have been given a hero's welcome, his celebratory parade was canceled for the same reason, that he was a black man and his traveling companion was white. We don't really know what Johnson thought about this snub, but it doesn't seem to have bothered him that much. But in any case, he didn't change a damn thing. If anything, now that he was the world heavyweight champion, he leaned into it even harder. If winning the heavyweight title had white America foaming at the mouth, Jack Johnson's personal life was about to send them into a nationwide hysteria. Here's another example of the kind of thing he was capable of. A couple of years after becoming heavyweight champ, Johnson tried to visit an upmarket all-white brothel in Chicago, but of course he was turned away because of the color of his skin. However, instead of arguing and causing a scene, he somehow convinced 5 of the white girls working there to go for a ride with him in his car. Let that sink in. Not only was he not allowed inside, but he walked away with half their staff. One of them was a woman named Belle Schreiber, the daughter of a policeman, and she was subsequently fired, along with the 4 other girls, for sleeping with Johnson. Schreiber then became Johnson's favorite and was often seen traveling with him. That is, until he met the next white girl on his list, his future wife, Etta Duryea, a glamorous and well-educated singer and piano player. Duryea was Johnson's new favorite, despite the fact that the other white women were both still on the scene. He bounced from woman to woman, never faithful to any of them, and he didn't care who was watching. To white America, this was the ultimate slap in the face. It wasn't just that he was rich, famous, and undefeated. It was that he was black, and he was doing things that even white men couldn't get away with. And just like that, Jack Johnson became the most hated black man in America. Whites couldn't stand the idea that a black man was the reigning champion, and when he fought, he even taunted his opponents in the ring and their teams outside of it as he put away challenger after challenger. He loved defeating white boxers, and his big gold-toothed grin that seemed to mock his defeated opponents and the seething crowds made it even worse. They wanted him gone, and so the search began. America needed a great white hope, a white fighter who could take the title back and restore the so-called natural order. This expression came to mean any promising white boxer who rises through the ranks past their black counterparts. But this is where it started. It was invented to find someone, anyone, who could stop Jack Johnson. And just to be clear, this wasn't just about sports. This was Jim Crow America, a time when racism wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. White supremacist views weren't whispered behind closed doors like they are today. They were printed in newspapers, like this little gem from the New York Times, published before Johnson's fight with Tommy Burns. If the black man wins, thousands and thousands of his ignorant brothers will misinterpret his victory as justifying claims to much more than mere physical equality with their white neighbors. If the Negro loses, the members of his race will be taunted and irritated because of their champion's downfall. This is the kind of undisguised racism that people felt perfectly free to express at the time. And so, great white hope after great white hope was brought forward to face him, and Johnson crushed them all. One of these infamous fights was against a man named Stanley Ketchel, who was actually a friend of Johnson's. Ketchel was much smaller and usually fought at middleweight, and for most of the fight, they seemed to approach the bout as more of an exhibition than a real boxing match. But then came the 14th round, and that's when Ketchel made a mistake he would never forget. Seeing an opening, Ketchel tried to go for the knockout. Now, let's give him credit. He actually knocked Johnson down. But once the furious Johnson was back on his feet, he launched himself viciously at his opponent, hitting him first with a body shot before knocking him out cold with a shot to the jaw. In the images of what happened next, Johnson can be seen pulling two of Ketchell's teeth out of his gloves. Let that sit for a second. Johnson hit him so hard that Ketchell's front teeth got lodged in the leather of his glove. And if that wasn't enough to unleash the racist wrath of white America, the sight of the victorious black man standing over yet another fallen white boxer certainly was. The cries for a great white hope reached a fever pitch. And now there was only one name that mattered: James Jeffries. The clamor began to rise for the former heavyweight champion to come out of retirement and reclaim the honor of the white race. But there was just one problem. Jeffries had been retired for 6 years. While Johnson had spent the last few years at his peak dominating the division, Jeffries had been, well, an alfalfa farmer. Not to mention he was at least 100 pounds over his optimal fighting weight. At first he refused, but under mounting public pressure and the promise of a purse of at least $101,000, Jeffries agreed to the bout. And just so there was no confusion about what this fight was really about, Jeffries made it crystal clear: I am going into this fight for the sole purpose of proving that a white man is better than a Negro. This wasn't just boxing anymore. This was a racial war. And so the stage was set for one of the most controversial and highly anticipated boxing matches in history. Now, if you ask any boxing fan nowadays who was involved in the fight of the century, they'll probably tell you it was Muhammad Ali and Smokin' Joe Frazier. But this fight between Johnson and Jeffries was the original fight of the century. Levels of racial tension were so high that on the day of the fight, guns were banned from the arena. I mean, sure, that seems kind of obvious in today's world. But what's ridiculous is that even apples weren't allowed into the venue in case they decided to start throwing them. This wasn't just about a championship belt. This was about Jeffries proving that a white man was still superior to a black man. And he took that mission very seriously. So finally, the former world champion and last great white hope was going to step into the ring to take down the unworthy champion, whipping himself into fighting shape and going into the contest as the bookie's favorite. But despite his transformation, next to Johnson, Jeffries looked like a man who'd been on a 6-year vacation. And so the bell rang. And Johnson didn't just beat Jeffries, he humiliated him. He toyed with him, he picked him apart round after round, and even put him down for the first time in his career. Johnson then knocked him down a second time. And in the 15th, when Johnson put Jeffries on the canvas for the third time, Jeffries' corner rushed into the ring before he could be counted out, stopping the fight to save him from the first KO defeat of his career. And so it goes. The last great white hope had fallen, and the country erupted into the first national race riots in U.S. history. If you thought white America hated him before, this victory pushed them over the edge. The tension that had been brewing finally boiled over. This fight wasn't just the fight of the century, it was the fight that changed America forever. The aftermath of Johnson's victory over Jeffries was as violent as it was inevitable. America exploded. Riots broke out across 25 states and 50 cities, started by both black communities and white mobs. At least 20 people lost their lives in the chaos. Some were killed in street brawls, but others were lynched. We both know who did the lynching. The illusion of white superiority had been shattered. And of course, having been the catalyst for all this by beating whites in the ring and threw his act out of it, Johnson continued to behave as he always had. His personal life became just as turbulent as his public one. He became suspicious that his latest white girlfriend, Etta, was having an affair with his chauffeur, so he hired a private investigator to uncover the truth. And when he finally confronted her, it turned violent. He beat her so badly that she ended up in the hospital. A year later, somehow, they made up, and in 1911, they got married, further outraging white fragility. Not only had Jack Johnson stolen their championship, now he had a white wife, and not just any white wife, but one from a wealthy, respected family. But beneath all the headlines and scandals, Johnson continued to abuse her and cheated on her constantly. And the pressure of being the white wife of the most hated black man in America became too much to bear. Only 1 year later, Etta Duryea took her own life. Now, most people would take a moment to reflect after something like that, but not Johnson. He had already started seeing yet another white woman, this time an 18-year-old prostitute from Minneapolis named Lucille Cameron. The pair married just over a year after the death of Duryea, and by this point, nobody was surprised anymore. White America raged, Johnson grinned, and the cycle continued. This marriage lasted 12 years, but in the end, even Cameron had enough and divorced him for his relentless infidelity. A year after that, Johnson did it again. This time, he married a third white woman, Irene Pinot, who stayed with him until his death. Johnson thought he was untouchable, and honestly, who could blame him? But even though he had beaten every so-called great white hope put in front of him, there were still those who were determined to break him. And soon enough, they got their chance. He was first arrested under the Mann Act, a law meant to stop human trafficking for transporting a white woman, his wife, across state lines. The case quickly fell apart. But then he was arrested again on similar charges, and this time the charges stuck. He was sentenced to a year and a day in prison, but instead he skipped bail and fled to Canada posing as a member of a black baseball team. From there he moved to France and spent the next 7 years living in exile with Cameron in Europe, Mexico, and South America. And it was during this time that Jack Johnson finally lost. In 1915 in Havana, Cuba, Johnson defended his title against Jess Willard, a white fighter from Kansas. The fight had been scheduled for 45 rounds. Yep, you heard that right. It's unbelievable how they could even consider a 45-round bout, right? Johnson started off well, but he began to tire, and he was knocked out in round 26. And immediately, rumors started flying. Many believed he threw the fight in exchange for a pardon on his charges and a deal to return home. But if he did, he was double-crossed. Because when he finally returned to the U.S., he was immediately arrested and sent to prison. He continued to box into his 50s and finally retired at the age of 60 with an official record of 68 wins, 11 losses, and 10 draws, with 4 no contests. And outside of boxing, his wild lifestyle never changed. Johnson had expensive taste, tailored clothing, jewelry, fast cars. At one time, he owned a so-called black and tan nightclub in Harlem, and even opened an interracial nightclub in Chicago called Café de Champion. He was a notoriously reckless driver, once handing a cop $100 for a $50 speeding ticket, telling him to keep the change because he intended to drive home the same way later, at exactly the same speed. That was Jack Johnson. His love for fast cars would eventually prove fatal, though. In 1946, he crashed into a telegraph pole and died at age 68. Just like that, the first black heavyweight champion of the world was gone. But his legacy? That was untouchable. Jack Johnson will always be remembered as a trailblazer who achieved immortality as the first black heavyweight champion, a man who defied the odds, the system, and white America at every turn. Some black commentators at the time looked down on his lifestyle, saying he was damaging the reputation of his race rather than helping it. But later, Muhammad Ali called Johnson an inspiration for being so brave. Ali said,
He said, just kill my black buggers, I'm gonna knock this white man cold. I know I'm bad, but he was crazy.
The big black man with golden teeth wasn't just a champion. He was a symbol of defiance, a menace that enraged white America because he beat every challenger they sent his way and lived however he wanted, with whoever he wanted. And there was absolutely nothing they could do about it. So what do you think about Johnson? Was he a trailblazer whose boldness paved the way for future black athletes, or a troublemaker who made things harder for them? We want to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We've got plenty more legendary stories coming your way. See you in the next one.